So this is the wheel. And I don't know if you guys have ever done like chocolate tasting, wine tasting, beer tasting. Like it's a very common sort of a wheel. Actually, my mom was like, I use something like that in counseling where I rate my patients. I'm like, I was just like unstable. Just kidding. So
did you ask her if she ever rated you?
Yeah, I probably should. I was afraid to ask. So, anyway, so what we tried to do with these words was make it to where, well, first of all, one of the things we were thinking about was how for all of us, and I totally include myself in this, my temptation is to be 5 stars. I loved it. 1 star, I hated it. And it's completely subjective and how I felt, which means it could even be dependent on like, whether I had PMS and whether I was mad at somebody, and you know what I mean? Like, it's just so like, I hated this book and actually it was just hormones. So this was supposed to help us be a little more objective. And one of the things we tried to do was frame it where, so basically it's kind of like if you could think of it as like a scale of 1 to 5, where like, it's let's take one example, like logical. Let's say like it was a good book, but it wasn't very logical. You'd be closer to the center. Like maybe you'd give it 1 or 2 on logic, right? So the goal was the better the book, the bigger the surface area would be that you would end up covered. So let me show you in case some of you didn't see the example. So in the example, Brooke Favorite did this whole journal, Jane Eyre. So with this, that's what I mean by surface area. So you draw the dots for each one and you connect the lines and then you can color it in. And the idea was the larger the surface area you end up covered, the better the book was. Whether we felt like it was better or not could be kind of like a separate thing. And of course will be factored in to like our final thing. But a good example would be How to Think. I read it. I didn't really like it. But I'm going to have to give it a better rating than I would have just based upon my subjective response to the book, because actually it didn't do too bad when I did it doesn't mean I'm giving him 5 stars, but I have to give him more stars than I was going to give him just because I felt betrayed by the title, because I didn't feel like I thought any better at all after reading that book. So I'm like, okay, really quickly, and Abby and Misty, I was going to have you chime in. But I just thought we'd go through what we mean by these words, because that was one of the questions was like, well, how do I know that what you meant by logical is what I mean by logical? And to some extent, it doesn't matter because it's not that objective. Because to me, it's like, as long as you're defining it the same way every time you do one of these, you're getting, you know what I mean? Like you're getting to where you have a standard way of thinking about a book and what you really think of it. But the first one was rereadable. And I think with that, I actually thought of that as being very subjective. Did you read it and come away with, yeah, I'd actually like to read this book again and it would be worthwhile. Like I would get more out of it if I read it a second time. Logical would be, I would say at a more of a, let me think about this really quick, make sure it's true. I was thinking of this more in like a micro view, like when your author makes arguments, is his logic good? Or is he making broad leaps and putting a bunch of assumptions? If you're using it for fiction, it would be like, this is where you're talking about where there are big gaps in the story, where you were like, okay, I'm just going to assume that this makes sense, but it didn't actually, you know what I'm saying? Like where you read some stories, or there's like a detective novel and you're like, but you didn't tell me that. So that I was thinking of it on like more of the micro level, and we compare that with something that comes later, which is harmonious. And I was thinking of that as being like the big logic, like did the whole work together? Or did you actually feel like it was an essay collection, even though it wasn't supposed to be an essay collection? Like essay collections will probably score lower on this because they don't necessarily, like it can just be a collection of essays and the unifying factor is who wrote them and not the topic. So that doesn't make it a worse book because that's the nature of the book. But I mean, for most of the books we're reading, right, like a novel or a nonfiction piece, it's supposed to all like have one unifying thought behind it or one unifying plot behind it. And so like for me, the harmonious was like the big logic. So then we say wise. And I would think that's where you get into like your, I was thinking more like this is where you get into things like scripture, like you're reading a book and ultimately its wisdom is when we compare it to what God actually says. Sometimes I feel wrong and I just need Misty's face to tell me I'm okay.
You're okay, Brandy.
Thank you. Okay. I just need something to pat me on the back. With believable, right? Two different things. So with a novel, obviously believable was like, were you able to get into that world and stay there? Or did you have to keep going? I'm just going to suspend my disbelief to stay in this world. I think most fiction books pass this test, but every once in a while you get into one where you're like, that's just not how the world works. And so you have trouble believing it because in no universe would this ever happen.
And sometimes you get that in nonfiction too.
Well, exactly. So that's the thing too, is believable. There's a couple ways to look at believable. So part of it would be like, if you're reading a science book and you know enough science where you're like, yeah, I don't actually think that's how that works. But the other thing is sometimes they tell anecdotes and you're like, you just made that up to make the book. Like I read a marriage book one time and I was like, this person pretended to be a marriage counselor or whatever. And she'd be like, this person emailed me. And it was like, the perfect story to make her point. But I was like, yeah, I don't think that really happened. I don't know. So it could be the author's skill in writing a believable story. Like it could just be how they presented it. But again, believability is kind of going to be subjective because some of us are able to get into a fantasy novel. And I have a few friends that like can't hardly bear to read fantasy because they can't get into the world. Like they're just like, magic's not real, but beautiful and quotable. I think they kind of go together, really, because with quotable, it could be kind of like wise, or it could just be you go through and you're like, hey, I got a lot of commonplace entries out of this book. So it was definitely quotable. But I think like with beautiful, you're kind of looking for like that turn of the phrase where you were just like, and by the way, so this is where bad books are dangerous, right? But it's an interesting experience to read them because sometimes you have a very unwise, in the scriptural sense, book that says something that sounds really nice until you realize it's a lie. It would actually still get a better score on beauty, right? I mean, kind of. So, I mean, then you can have the debate. Can something be beautiful when it's not true? Which is an interesting debate to have. But in the subjective sense, I mean, I'm kind of thinking like the blasphemous prayer at the end of the inauguration sounded so nice, but we are praying to in the name of our collective faith. As a Christian, I have to say, dangerous. So, but we all know, right? Satan comes, he's a liar. He comes wrapped in light. He's a deceiver. And I actually think it's really interesting to compare beauty with wise and be like, okay, so we had a turn of the phrase that was very captivating, but low on wisdom. We would actually classify that as a dangerous book. Not that you don't read them, but that this might actually help us be aware that it was a dangerous book to go through the thinking process. So for me, I was going to discipline myself, and I didn't have the wheel when I read How to Think. And going back and doing it a couple weeks later actually didn't work very well. Like I would have been better to have been able to do it within about 48 hours of finishing the book, I think. If you have the journal, there are 25 of those. So you have the 4-page spread for all 25 books, which means you have 25 wheels to rate 25 books.
So the overarching idea for this, for the 5x5 and for the journal, is part of, the reading widely is the 5x5, right? We want to go broad and we want to have some depth to it. And so that's why we do 5 different categories. And then the think deeply. So this is basically for those of you who are like, well, I just don't know how to contemplate. I just don't know what that means or how to do these things. And if you're not going to read The Intellectual Life by Sertalange, which is not an easy read, I would say, and it has a lot of other stuff in it. Like, this is just a way for you to get your feet wet. This is a guided way for you to just think about these things in a different way. And instead of it just going in and out, right, we actually pause to think about it. It's so that you are not being, what is it, a book glutton, right, Brandy? So that you're just taking that moment to think about those things. So it doesn't have to be, this long process. It really doesn't. This is just a tool to help you think about it, because narrating a book also is really helpful, and this is kind of a form of narration where you're thinking back through what you liked and what you didn't. So